Booster Draft 12 and Booster Draft 13, please make your way over to the Garrick, to the right of the stage.
So, who can tell me what a replacement effect is? Stand up.
Sealed grinder number 1 and sealed grinder number 6.
I actually couldn't hear what you just said.
An effect that changes the rules of the game.
So the answer, this suggested answer is an effect that changes the rules of the game.
4 and sealed 1. The pairings have been posted.
Does anyone else have something they'd like to offer? Topher?
It's an effect that changes one event into another.
Topher says it's an effect that changes one event into another, which is a more accurate description. A replacement effect is any effect that completely or partially replaces one event with another event. Generally, replacement effects are continuous effects. They're not one-shot effects. They apply continuously as events happen, and they look for the event that they're going to replace. There's one exception. Sometimes you'll have an effect of a resolving spell or ability that is also a replacement effect. We call this a self-replacement effect, and I'll get into more detail about that later on. So how do we recognize when an effect is a replacement effect? There are certain key words or key phrases that you'll be looking for. For example, effects that use the word instead are replacement effects. These include regeneration effects, which are shorthanded generally as regenerate or regeneration. But if you were to write out the full text of a regeneration effect, it would use the word instead. An effect that uses the word skip is a replacement effect. Then we have a large category of effects that modify how something enters the battlefield. There are different templates for it. It might say, this permanent enters the battlefield with, or as this permanent enters the battlefield, or this permanent enters the battlefield as, or objects enter the battlefield, and then it'll have more detail depending on what the effect does. And finally, there are also a category of effects called prevention effects, which essentially function identically to replacement effects. And we'll be, again, talking about these later on as well. So let's look at some examples. Instead, one example is Obstinate Bailoff, which says, if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Obstinate Bailoff, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into your graveyard. We have a couple examples of regeneration effects. This is a spell, Regenerate, and this actually, the reminder text has the rules text for a regeneration effect.
Judge Jason.
And as you can see, hopefully you can see from here, it uses the word instead. It says, the next time a creature would be destroyed, instead tap it, remove all damage, and remove it from combat. And then there's another example of regeneration, which is a creature with the regenerate ability. Here's an example of of an effect that uses the word skip. Blinding Angel causes a player to skip his or her next combat phase. Now we'll look at a bunch of enters the battlefield replacement effects. Carnifex Demon enters the battlefield with 2 counters on it. Nevermore says, as it enters the battlefield, name a non-land card. Clone says, enters the battlefield as a copy of some other creature. Rotting Legion enters the battlefield tapped. And Urabrask says, creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. And now I'll show you an example of a prevention effect, which is Fog, which says prevent all combat damage.
Standard Winnabox number 7.
Any questions so far?
Over to Garrick.
Okay, let's keep going. So here are some questions for you. Here's a card, Doubling Season. How many people say the Doubling Season has a replacement effect? And how many people say that it does not? Well, you're all correct. Doubling season uses the word instead, therefore its abilities create replacement effects. The next one is Vesuva. How many people believe that Vesuva has a replacement effect? And how many people believe it does not?
Players, if you registered before
Vesuva
1 p.m.,
enters the
you
battlefield
can now
tapped.
verify your buys in 3 locations around the room. To the right of the Grand Prix stage, at the information booth, and over by to the right of the side event stage as well. As a note, if you signed up for the Sleep In special, your name will be preceded by 3 Z's. So don't worry if you're not in the normal lineup of things. Make sure that you check at the end that your name shows up with 3 Z's in front of it, and that you have the appropriate number of buys.
Vesuva enters the battlefield tapped and is a copy of another land. Next one, Core Skyfisher. How many people believe that Core Skyfisher has a replacement effect? And how many people believe it does not? Core Skyfisher does have a triggered ability that triggers when it enters the battlefield, but this is not a replacement effect. It doesn't modify anything. It's just an additional effect that happens when the ability resolves. Mugosi the Waterfowl. How many people believe this card has a replacement effect? And how many people believe it does not?
Eric Johnson?
How many people believe it has more than one? This actually has 2 replacement effects. One is it enters the battlefield tapped, and the other one is an ability that causes a player to skip their turn. Next example. How many people believe that Grafdigger's Cage has a replacement effect? And how many people believe it does not?
Robert Miller and James Henderson to the Grand Prix stage at your convenience, please. Robert Miller and James Henderson to the Grand Prix stage at your convenience.
Grafdigger's Cage does not have a replacement effect. It does not use the word instead. It just prohibits something from happening. That's not a replacement effect. Sure, can we go back to Mugosi? Taking an extra turn is not a replacement effect. It's just an additional effect that happens. And this is our last example, Rising Waters.
Sealed grinder number 7.
How many people believe Rising Waters has a replacement effect?
Once again, sealed grinder.
And how many people believe it does not?
The seats for deck construction are being posted.
Again, Rising Waters does not use the word instead or any of the other wording the replacement effects use, so this does not have a replacement effect. Now I'm going to explain self-replacement effects. Self-replacement effects are an effect of resolving or a spell or ability that replaces part of that spell or ability, and it changes how that spell or ability would resolve. Also, whenever we are applying multiple replacement effects, self-replacement effects are always applied first. So now I'm going to ask you about whether these cards have self-replacement effects. Rock's Faithmender says, if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead. How many people believe this is a self-replacement effect? And how many believe it is not? Most people apparently have no opinion. What's the answer? This is not a self-replacement effect. And after we see the next example, I'll get into a bit why that is. Searing Blaze. The second ability of Searing Blaze uses the word instead, so it is a replacement effect.
Please report to Garrick.
How many people say that this is a self-replacement effect? And how many say that it is not? It is a self-replacement effect. And here's one guideline you can use. If a replacement effect can replace external events, it is not a self-replacement effect. So Rock's Faithmender's replacement effect can apply anytime you gain life, not just when you're gaining life from its own lifelink. Therefore, it's not a self-replacement effect. Searing Blaze's replacement effect can only affect Searing Blaze itself. Let's look at the next one. Loxodon Smiter, similar to Obstinate Baloth, has a replacement effect that puts it onto the battlefield instead of going to the graveyard when it is discarded. How many of you say that this is a self-replacement effect? And how many say that it is not? It is not a self-replacement effect. So a self-replacement effect is part of a resolving spell or ability that replaces part of or all of that ability with the replacement effect's effect. So this is not a separate ability on Loxodon Smiter. What it replaces is an opponent causing you to discard a card. That's not an ability of Loxodon Smiter making you discard it. It's something else that's happening. So the self-replacement effect rule doesn't apply to the Loxodon Smiter. Any questions so far? Okay, now let's look at the interaction of multiple effects, because this is where things get kind of tricky. So the first situation, before I get to the situations, some rules on this. So when you have multiple replacement effects, they have to be applied in one order or another. Who chooses? The affected player or the controller of the affected object chooses. If the object has no controller, then the owner of the affected object chooses. Also, when you're determining what order to apply replacement effects in, there's rules for that, as we'll see. Of course, self-replacement effects apply first. If there are any control changes, those apply next. Then copy effects, and then everything else. Now you'll note, this is not the same order that we apply layers in when we're using continuous effects. These are their own set of rules. Don't get them confused or mixed up. When you're applying multiple replacement effects, you start at the top of the list until there are no more replacement effects in that category, and then you go down the list. So if there were multiple self-replacement effects, those would all be applied first before any control changes or any copy effects. Then you do all the control changes, then all the copy effects, and everything else. You'll also find sometimes that applying one replacement effect causes another replacement effect to be irrelevant or to newly become relevant. So here's our first example. Alice controls Ghosts of the Innocent. Ghost of the Innocent says if a source would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals half that damage instead. Alice also controls Furnace of Wrath, which says if a source would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals double that damage to that creature or player instead. Now we need a source of damage. Alice casts Lava Axe, targeting Ned. So what happens, and who is the affected player? Who's getting to decide? Who would like to take a crack at this one? Topher? Stand up.
The target of the Lava Axe, so Ned.
Okay, Ned is the affected player. And what happens?
He gets to choose whether he wants to double it and then cut it in half, or cut it in half and then double it.
So Topher says he can choose whether to double it first and then have it, or have it and then double it. So we do have two replacement effects that both are applicable here. Ned is the affected player because he's the one taking damage. So he's the one who gets to decide the order. If he applies the effect of Ghost of the Innocent first, Lava Axe's damage is halved to 2, and then Furnace of Wrath doubles it to 4.
To the right of the stage. Booster draft 14.
Or if he applies Furnace first, it's doubled to 10, and then halved to 5. So as you can see, the order in which you apply these effects can change the ultimate outcome. Let's look at the next situation. Alice controls Phytohydra. Phytohydra says if damage will be dealt to it, instead put that many +1/+1 counters on it. Ned activates Killsuit Cultist. Killsuit Cultist says the next time damage would be dealt to target creature this turn, destroy that creature instead. Ned casts Inferno, which deals 6 damage to all players and all creatures. So again, who's deciding what happens and what will happen? Who would like to try this one?
Alice gets to choose because it's affecting the creature she controls.
Okay. Alice does get to choose because it's her creature.
Then she gets to choose whether she applies the damage from the kill suit.
Commander 1, please report to the side event stage. Once again, Commander 1.
Okay, so what happens after she chooses which one to apply?
If she applies the Hydra first, then no damage will be dealt, and the creature will live. If she applies it in the other order, the creature will die from the effect of the cultist.
Okay, so depending on what Alice chooses, let's go to the next slide. Again, we have two different replacement effects here. Both of them are replacing the damage that Inferno would deal to Phytohydra.
Eric Cruz, please report to your event. Eric Cruz.
If Alice applies Phytohydra's effect first, then she puts 6 +1/+1 counters on it, and then Killsuit Cultist effect no longer applies because Phytohydra is no longer being dealt damage. If instead she applies Killsuit Cultist replacement effect first, Phytohydra will be destroyed by that effect, and because, again, it's replacing the damage,
Standard Winnabox number 3.
then Phytohydra's own effect no longer
Once
applies.
again, standard Winnabox 3.
Any questions so far? Is Phytohydra's effect a self-replacement effect? Why not? Stand up.
It affects more than itself.
Phytohydra's effect can affect more than itself. It affects Phytohydra anytime Phytohydra is dealt damage. It does not replace its own effect. Okay, now Alice controls Crumbling Sanctuary, which says for each damage that will be dealt to Alice, she removes the top card of her library from the game instead. And Ned controls Divine Presence, which says if a source would deal 4 or more damage to a creature or player, it deals 3 damage to that creature or player instead. And here we have Ned casting Inferno again. So what happens to Alice? Who would like to tell me what happens to Alice?
Since Alice is the one who's being affected by this, she's the affected player and gets to choose which order the replacement effects are applied in.
Yes, Alice gets to choose the order.
If she applies the Divine Presence first, she, instead of taking 6 damage, takes 3 damage, and then the Crumbling Sanctuary will apply to the 3 damage instead of the 6. If she instead applies them in the opposite order, if she applies Crumbling Sanctuary first, she'll have to Crumbling Sanctuary for 6, and then Divine Presence will have nothing to replace.
That's correct. I'm going to go over the answer for those of you who weren't able to hear. Again, we have 2 different replacement effects which can be applied to Inferno's damage. Alice is the one being damaged, so she chooses the order. If she applies Crumbling Sanctuary's effect first, she exiles 6 cards from her library, and then Divine Presence has nothing to do. If instead she applies Divine Presence first,
Once again,
it changes.
Commander 1.
It changes the amount of damage Inferno would deal from 6 to 3, and then Crumbling Sanctuary applies, and she exiles the top 3 cards of her library. Here's another Divine Presence question. This time Ned controls Pyromancer's Swath, which says if an instant or sorcery you control would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals that much damage plus 2. And Divine Presence, again, reduces anything from 4 or more to 3. Again, Ned casting Inferno. So who can tell me what happens here to Alice? Come on, if the last one was easy, this one should be easy too. I'm going to pick someone else this time. Yes, Alice is the affected player.
If you sign up for Standard Grinder number 4, Standard Grinder 4, the pairings have been posted. Please find your seats.
You're on the right track.
Then divine presence won't affect. Won't be affected.
If she applies Inferno first, divine presence. She applies Pyromancer's Swath first. Divine presence will still apply because it's still 4 or more. So let's look at. 8 will become 3. So let's look at the explanation now. Again, both effects can potentially apply to Inferno's damage. Alice is the one being damaged, so she chooses the order. If she applies Pyromancer's Swath's effect first, Inferno will deal 8 damage instead of 6. Then Divine Presence changes that to 3. If she applies Divine Presence first, it changes the 6 to a 3, and then Pyromancer's Swath changes that to a 5. Go to the next slide. Okay, so Divine Presence's effect says anytime a source will deal 4 or more damage to a player, it deals 3 instead. So why doesn't Divine Presence stop a source from ever dealing more than 3 damage? Why? Because in one case, Alice was...
Once again, standard grinder.
In one of those 2 series of applications, Alice took 5 damage. Why doesn't Divine Presence change that to 3?
Because you can never apply the same replacement effect to the same event twice. Right.
A replacement effect only ever applies once. Once it's been applied, it will never go back and reapply.
Window box 8. Please make your way to the Garrett banner, to the right of the stage.
Okay. In this situation, Alice controls a Sarah Angel, which is enchanted by Mammoth Umbra. Mammoth Umbra's totem armor ability says if enchanted creature would be destroyed, instead remove all damage from it and destroy the aura. Ned casts Debt of Loyalty on Sarah Angel. Debt of Loyalty says regenerate target creature. You gain control of it if it regenerates this way this turn. And then Ned casts Murder on Sarah Angel. So what happens to Sarah Angel and who decides?
Kyle Kinsey, if you're in the hall, please come to side beds. Travis Sowers, Kyle Kinsey, if you're in the hall, please come to sides.
Because Alice's creature is the one that's affected, she gets to choose the order of the replacement effects. She can choose Mammoth Umbra to happen, which would then destroy the Mammoth Umbra, and then it would no longer be to regenerate.
Dustin Cox of Grinder 2, your event is ready. Dustin Cox of Grinder number 2, your event is waiting.
That would no longer need to gain control, or wouldn't gain control of the creature at that point. Or she could have them apply in reverse order, and then regenerate, which would then he would gain control of Sarah Angel, enchanted with the Mammoth Umbra.
Okay, let's look at the explanation. Alice is the controller of Sarah Angel, so she gets to choose the order. Did you have a question? I'll get to that at the end of the explanation. If she applies the effect of Debt of Loyalty first, Sarah Angel is regenerated, and because of Debt of Loyalty's effect, Ned gains control of it. And at that point, Mammoth Umbra's effect no longer applies because Sarah Angel is no longer being destroyed. If instead she applies the effect of Mammoth Umbra first, then she destroys Mammoth Umbra, and Sarah Angel is not destroyed. And then Debt of Loyalty's effect no longer applies because the creature is no longer being destroyed. However, Debt of Loyalty's effect does set up a regeneration shield, so if later that turn Sarah Angel is destroyed again, then Debt of Loyalty's shield would be used up at that point. Next situation, Alice controls Rock's Faith Mender, which says if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead. During her upkeep, she activates Words of Worship, which says the next time you draw a card this turn, gain 5 life instead. What happens in Alice's draw step?
When she goes to draw her card for the turn, the Words of Worship ability would apply to the draw and replace it with gaining 5 life. And then Faith Mender would apply to that and replace it with gaining 10 life.
Okay, let's look at the explanation now. So at the beginning of Alice's draw step, when she's about to draw her card, only one replacement effect applies, which is Words of Worship. And it changes her draw card to gain 5 life. Now at this point, Rox's Faithbender's effect now becomes relevant because she's gaining life. So even though it did not apply to the original event of draw a card, it still gets to be applied to the modified event. And Alice gains 10 life. Any questions so far? Okay, let's look at the next one. Alice controls doubling season. Doubling season says, if an effect would put 1 or more tokens onto the battlefield under your control, put twice that many onto the battlefield instead. She's currently at 4 life, and she casts Gather the Townsfolk, which says, put 2 human creature tokens onto the battlefield, but if you have 5 or less life, instead put 5 tokens onto the battlefield. How many creature tokens does Alice get? Yes?
Gather the Townsfolk is a self-ritual effect, so you will always apply first. So you get the 5, and then that number is double that number.
Okay, so
Booster draft number 15.
let's go on to the explanation.
Stage right, to the right of the stage.
Gather the Townsfolk has a self-replacement effect, so that is always applied first. Changes the 2 into a 5, and then doubling season changes the 5 into 10. You can never apply doubling season first before the self-replacement effect. In the next situation, Alice controls Leyline of the Void, which says if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. She casts Spectre's Wail, targeting Ned, which says target player discards a card from his hand. Ned discards Loxodon's Smiter, which says if a spell or ability an opponent controls causes you to discard Loxodon's Smiter, put it onto the battlefield instead of putting it into the graveyard. Where does Loxodon's Smiter end up, and who decides? Topher?
Ned is affected. He is the owner of the object that doesn't have a controller. So he
Again, booster draft.
Yes.
He can apply.
Please report to the arrow on the right of the
battlefield, or he can apply the ley line and exile.
Okay. Loxodon's Smiter doesn't have a controller because it's not on the battlefield or the stack, but it does have an owner, which is Ned, so he's the affected player. He gets to choose the order. If he applies Leyline of the Void's effect first, he exiles Loxodon's Smiter. And of course, its own effect no longer applies because it's no longer going to the graveyard. If he applies Loxodon's Smiter's effect first, it's put onto the battlefield, and then Leyline of the Void's effect no longer applies because it's not being put into the graveyard. Any questions so far? Okay, here's another Serra Angel. This time, Alice has enchanted Serra Angel with Infinite Reflection, which says, non-token creatures you control enter the battlefield as a copy of enchanted creature.
Please make your way to draft 15.
Alice also has Dearly Departed in her graveyard. Dearly Departed says, as long as it's in your graveyard, each human creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And Alice casts a human spell, Champion of the Parish. Can Champion of the Parish enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter? Stand up. Why can it not enter the battlefield with a counter? Speak up.
It's not a human when it enters the battlefield.
Okay, why is that?
Because the placement effect on the reflection causes it to enter the battlefield.
Okay, what did you want to say? Yeah.
Both of those effects are trying to apply to it, but the thing that makes it a copy of Serra Angel applies first. and because it turns it into a copy of Sarah Angel, which is not a human, the effect from Dearly Departed can no longer apply to it.
So we do have two replacement effects that could apparently, at the beginning of the effect apply to Champion of the Parish entering the battlefield. Infinite Reflection says it enters the battlefield as a copy of Sarah Angel, and Dearly Departed says if it's human, it enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. However, Infinite Reflection's effect is a copy effect, so it must be applied first. Once it's applied, Champion of the Parish is no longer a human, and therefore Dearly Departed's effect does not apply. Cases like this are one of the reasons that copy effects must be applied before other effects. So there's no way for Alice to make Champion of the Parish enter the battlefield with a counter. Any questions on this one? This is not a question of layers, because these are replacement effects. Replacement effects and layers work differently. Okay, now Alice controls Essence of the Wild, which says creatures you control enter the battlefield as a copy of Essence of the Wild. She casts Goblin Rally, and in response, Ned casts Gather Specimens, which says if a creature would come into play under an opponent's control, it comes into play under your control instead.
Once again, sealed 5.
What happens?
As well as sealed 3. The pairings are posted now.
Since control applies above copy, they will enter the battlefield as goblin tokens under Ned's control.
That's correct. Control applies before copy, and this is pretty much the reason why. So Essence of the Wild's effect must be applied last. Gather Specimens effect is applied first. So Ned gets 4 goblin tokens. And I want to emphasize that this is different from layers, because if you look at the layer system, when you're applying continuous effects, copy effects apply before control effects. This is the other way around, and it's important that you can make that distinction. In this situation, Ned controls Pulmonic Sliver, which says all slivers have, if this creature would be put into the graveyard, you may put it on top of its owner's library instead. Alice targets Pulmonic Sliver with Annihilating Fire, which says Annihilating Fire deals 3 damage to target creature or player.
5 and sealed 3. The pairings are up.
If a creature dealt damage this way would die this turn, exile it instead. What happens to Pulmonic Sliver, and who decides? Come on, someone can tell me what happens to Pulmonic Sliver. Stand up. Okay, Ned decides. And what does Ned decide?
Either put on top of his library or exile it.
So we have 2 effects here. Annihilating Fire, which is trying to exile it, and Pulmonic Sliver, which is trying to put Pulmonic Sliver on top of the library. If Ned applies Annihilating Fire first, it's exiled, and then Pulmonic Sliver's effect no longer applies. If he applies Pulmonic Sliver's effect first, he can put it on top of his library, and if he does, Annihilating Fire's effect no longer applies. Go back one. Why is Annihilating Fire not a self-replacement effect? Topher?
Because it can modify external things.
Annihilating Fire's effect can apply anytime the creature dies, not just when it's dealt damage from Annihilating Fire. So therefore it's not a self-replacement effect. Now I want to look at damage redirection effects. This is a subset of replacement effects. Ned controls Palisade Giant. Palisade Giant says all damage that will be dealt to you or another permanent you control is dealt to Palisade Giant instead. Alice casts Incinerate, targeting Ned. Ned then casts Civi's Valor, targeting Palisade Giant. Civi's Valor says all damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn is dealt to you instead. What happens to the damage that Incinerate deals?
So we can choose to put the series value first, so the damage is not too great. And focus about the Palisade Giant.
Anthony Hill,
We can have it.
Connor Russell.
Palisade Giant.
Anthony Hill, Connor Russell. Please come up to me.
So he can read the
So let me do a poll here. How many people believe that the damage can end up on Palisade Giant? Anyone believe it can end up on Palisade Giant? How many people believe it can end up on Ned? Let's look at the explanation. So at the beginning, only Palisade Giant replacement effects applies because Civi's Valor only applies the damage to a creature, and Incinerate is targeting Ned. However, after Palisade Giant's effect is applied, Civi's Valor's effect now becomes relevant, and that must be applied also. Therefore, Incinerate deals damage to Ned. It can never deal damage to Palisade Giant. Suppose Alice had targeted Palisade Giant instead of targeting Ned. What would happen?
The damage would be dealt to Palisade Giant since its ability does not replace that damage. Civi's Valor's ability would, or its effect would now apply and replace it with damage being dealt to Ned. Then Palisade Giant's effect would apply and replace it damage being dealt back to Palisade Giant.
Yeah.
Basically, yes. These effects will apply in the other order if Alice begins by targeting Palisade Giant. So the damage is always going to end up wherever she originally sent it. Another redirection question. Ned controls Imperial Archangel, which says all damage that would be dealt to you is dealt to Imperial Archangel instead. I don't know what happened to that slide. Ned also controls Sphere of Law, which says if a red source would deal damage to you, prevent 2 of that damage. I think we're going to get the rest of it now. Now Alice casts Incinerate targeting Ned. So how much damage does Incinerate deal? And where? And who decides?
Stephen Nanawat? Stephen Nanawat. Derek Gorner.
He can either
Please report to your event.
to apply first. If he apply the Sphere of Law, then first, then Palisade Angel will take only 1 damage. If not, Palisade Angel will take 3 damage.
So we have 2 replacement effects that can be applied at the beginning of this process. Ned is being dealt damage, so he gets to choose in what order to apply the effects. If he applies Sphere of Law's effect, then Incinerate deals 1 damage to him, which gets redirected to Imperial Archangel. If he applies Imperial Archangel's effect first, it's redirected to Imperial Archangel, and then Sphere of Law no longer applies.
Number 9. Standard number 9. Please make
Okay.
your involvement.
I haven't really gone over the Planeswalker rules, so here's a Planeswalker question for you. Alice controls Vraska the Unseen, which has 5 loyalty counters on it. She also controls Imperial Archangel. And Ned is about to cast Inferno. There he goes. Ned casts Inferno. Can Ned use Inferno to kill Vraska?
Standard Grinder 3.
And who decides?
Standard Grinder 3.
Who would like to answer this question?
Yes, he can. He can choose to redirect the damage that would go to the player to the Planeswalker instead. The Imperial Archangel's effect would apply.
Would what?
It would not apply.
Okay. Anybody else have any opinions on this? It's a little bit more complicated than it appears at first. Let's take a look at why. So first, let's look at the Planeswalker redirection rule, just so we're all on the same page. If non-combat damage will be dealt to a player by a source controlled by an opponent, the opponent may have that source deal that damage to a planeswalker the player controls instead. This is a redirection effect, which is a type of replacement effect. The opponent, go back one. The opponent chooses whether to redirect the damage as the redirection effect is applied. So this is just like any other replacement effect, except it's not generated by a card, it's generated by the rules. So we have two redirection effects that can both be applied to the damage Inferno is dealing to Alice. One is the Planeswalker redirection effect, and the other one is Imperial Archangel. Because Alice is the affected player, she gets to decide in what order to apply these effects. She might choose to apply the Planeswalker redirection rule first. If that's the case, then Ned decides whether to redirect the damage to Vraska. And if he does, Imperial Archangel's effect no longer applies.
Jarek Shields.
However, Alice may choose to apply Imperial Archangel's effect first. In that case, Inferno's damage is redirected to Imperial Archangel, and then the Planeswalker redirection rule no longer applies. So the answer is, yes, Ned can kill Vraska, but only if Alice decides to choose to apply the order, to apply the replacement effects in an order that allows him to do so. Yes. So the question is, when does Alice choose what order to apply the replacement effects in? And by corollary, when does Ned choose whether to apply the Planeswalker redirection rule? So Alice begins by choosing a replacement effect that could apply to the damage. And if she chooses the Planeswalker redirection rule, then at that point Ned decides whether to use it. So if she says Planeswalker redirection rule first, then Ned gets to decide whether to use it. If he chooses not to, she goes on to another effect. If she chooses to apply the Imperial Archangel redirection effect first, then the Planeswalker redirection rule will never apply, so Ned will never have the option or the ability to choose whether to use it. Any questions on replacement effects? Topher.
That last bit there. If Ned casts his Inferno, and as he's casting it, it says 6 to Vraska. When Alice applies those in the order and puts Vraska's first, can Ned change his mind?
So the question is, suppose Ned says Inferno 6 to Vraska, and Alice says, wait, hold on, I have to order the replacement effects. Okay, I'll choose the Planeswalker redirection rule first. Can Ned change his mind at that point? How many of you say that yes, Ned can change his mind? And how many of you say that Ned may not change his mind? Ned cannot change his mind because he's made a choice that would be made during the resolution of his spell. He's held to that choice unless his opponent responds to the spell. She hasn't done anything to respond. She's only pointed out that there is a decision to be made here. So she chooses to apply the Planeswalker redirection rule first. Ned is held to his previous choice. If she applies the other effect first, then the choice becomes irrelevant. Any other questions?
We're assuming this is a competitive, right?
Well, the MTR applies to any event.
Okay.
Okay, well, thank you all for attending.